Sigal, look, one question that many people are asking right now is that precisely because the administration has been imposing large numbers of designations, doing a lot in the sanctions area, how much difference does this new round of sanctions make?
So first of all, I wanted to thank you, Annie, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, Dennis. Look, I think fundamentally we are engaged in this maximum pressure campaign to deny Iran the revenue that it has historically used to do things like build out its WMD program, the reign of terror that it has engaged in and financed around the world, the support that it's providing for the brutal Assad regime. And so our efforts, every time we step up yet another effort in the maximum pressure campaign, that means ultimately that we're denying them the revenue that they would otherwise need to engage in those highly destabilizing acts. This morning, of course, Secretary Pompeo announced additional sanctions against Chinese entities. Late last week, we sanctioned the Central Bank of Iran specifically for engaging in its own reign of terror. And recently, we sanctioned companies in India, Lebanon, UAE, and Singapore. And every time we are doing that, we are showing with a lot of might that we are going to continue to clamp down on those sources of revenue. We know that the Iranians are going to try to find different deceptive means to continue to fund themselves, and every step up in the maximum pressure campaign denies them the ability to do so.
So I mean, I don't want to trivialize it, but is some of this almost like a whack-a-mole approach?
There's no whack-a-mole, of course. We have broad authorities that the president has authorized over the last year, the reimposition of the nuclear-related sanctions, the broad sectoral type of sanctions against the petroleum industry, the metals, obviously the petrochemicals, now the Supreme Leader's Office. So that's not a whack-a-mole. That's clamping down in a very significant way on the streams of revenue that they would have otherwise relied on.
Now, obviously, because you've done a lot, when you take an additional step, by definition, it implies that you didn't do everything you could. So is there still more scope for additional sanctions as well?
Well, as you saw this morning in the sanctions that Secretary Pompeo announced, that's an action that is enforcing the sanctions that we already have in place. So, of course,
sanctions are an act of war. She's speaking.
So of course,
sanctions are an act of war. You're preventing food and medicine from getting into Iran.
So of course
you're killing people. Fuck all of you.
Okay, but that one thing about the United States is that we do allow protests, we do allow people to speak, and by the way, he makes a point that might be worth responding to, because he said it's not just. Yeah. He said it's an act of war. One can argue that it's not an act of war, but he does say it's hurting people. So how do you respond to that?
I think fundamentally it's really important to have a conversation about what the Iranians are doing to their own people. Number one, by continuing to spend so much money on their WMD program, on Hezbollah, Hamas, the Quds Force, et cetera, they are diverting resources that should otherwise be used to feed their own people. The other thing that I think is really important for people to understand is that this is a regime that regularly recruits vulnerable refugees and children and sends them to places like Syria, where they go and they fight and they die. And of course, when the people of Iran stand up in peaceful protest, what do? They throw them in places like Evin prison, where they are tortured. And we have been systematically exposing that kind of behavior because ultimately what we want is for the Iranian people to prosper and for their government to stop prioritizing the funding of terror and start prioritizing on what should be their internal domestic priorities.
Is there, because I understand the sanctions are not designed to deny food or medicine to the Iranian public. Obviously, we see, though, indications that the price goes up dramatically. What is it that we're doing that's designed to ensure that the sanctions are maximizing the pressure on the regime, but not necessarily maximizing the pressure on the public?
So we have long had in place general licenses that authorize the provision of humanitarian goods and food, and of course, those are very much continued to be in place, and as
You are killing our labor movement. You're killing our labor movement. You're killing our feminist movement. You're killing every environmentalist in Iran. You're pushing us to the right. You're making what the right wing of Iran.
again, I think, Dennis, the key here, as I said before, those general licenses, as I said, they remain in place. We do see food and medicine continue to be, exported into the country. There's no question about that. You see that in the trade data. But again, the fundamental change that needs to happen here is
what she is doing, you are a weapon of mass destruction of the humanity of the Iranian people. You are killing people. You are denying people.
It is interesting that Ron Dermer, when we were having this conversation before, he made the point that it would be wonderful if the people who are here protesting here had the same opportunity to protest in Iran, had the same ability to use Facebook in Iran. The truth is, we don't deny people the right to protest, and it would be great if the Iranians adopted a similar posture. It would also be good if they put their people first. In a sense, that's what you're saying.
I think that's exactly right. Again, I mean, if you had these kinds of protests in Iran, what you would see is what we've seen historically, which is those, very sadly, those people are rounded up, they're put in jail. We had a sanctions action last year where we sanctioned Evan Prison. We've sanctioned members of the judiciary for precisely that type of horrific activity. You engage in peaceful protest in Iran and you're thrown in jail and you're tortured. And that is simply unacceptable. That's unacceptable behavior. The world needs to know it. They need to understand it. They need to understand that children are sent to places like Syria where they go, they fight, and they die. We've exposed that also in numerous times in actions that we have taken. And fundamentally, we have sought, again, to deprive them of the revenue that they've needed to engage in that activity, and that's going to continue with full force.
So how much... Obviously, this is a full-time job for you, and I think, as Mark was saying, it's also a mission for you. How much do you deal with our allies? How responsive are our allies to the kind of message that you're emphasizing, and how willing are they to join in these kinds of steps?
So we're in constant discussion with our allies on these issues all over the world. Of course, with our European allies, I've just returned from a trip to the Middle East. Have had a lot of discussions in Asia with a number of our partners there, and what you're really seeing, actually, in addition, and I think, look, the Europeans understand what's going on here, right? They themselves very sadly have had to thwart assassination plots over the last year. They themselves have been abused by the Iranians in their financial system. And so we have a very, very, very shared understanding of that.
You're a terrorist. The United States ended the war.
So I think we very much have a shared understanding of the threat. But the other piece of it that I think is really important to appreciate and understand is that companies, financial institutions, other companies all around the world similarly understand that if they do business with Iran, they put themselves at great risk of helping to fund and finance the terrorism that the Iranians have been engaged in. And that's why I think that you saw, after the president made his announcement, you saw companies, first of all, most of the banks had never gone in there because they had also had this fundamental understanding that if they were going to go in there this time, they were putting themselves at great risk. But lots of companies came out immediately. Similarly, I think, because they just didn't want to have anything to do with, not only were they worried about exposure of our sanctions, but they didn't want to have anything to do with a regime that's funding terror. The worst thing that could possibly happen to a company, right, is to find out that they had engaged in some trade, and that trade was then used in Syria in a chemical weapons attack. That's a nightmare for every reason imaginable.
And obviously that's a major part of what you're conveying to banks and companies and so forth.
Absolutely, we send that message all over the world, which again I think is what was so important about the action that we took last Friday against the Central Bank of Iran. If you look at the information that we put out with that action, you will see that the Central Bank of Iran, the center of Iran's financial system, has been engaged systematically in funding terror organizations. We've exposed that numerous times over the last couple of years, and we exposed it to greater effect, where we pointed out that in 2018 and 19, the Central Bank of Iran had been transporting or transferring billions of US dollars and euros to finance the Quds Force, to finance Hezbollah, to finance the Houthis and others. And
I mean, I do find it interesting that while we're a country where protest is allowed, there are a lot of people who like to protest to deny others from being able to speak. So let me, I've not only been a practitioner, but I've also been a longtime student of international relations. One of the things about sanctions always take time to work. If you look historically at different examples where sanctions are applied, eventually they had an impact on Gaddafi, but they took a long time. If you go back and you look at Milosevic, those sanctions took a long time. Sanctions, by definition, can be an instrument that does work, but almost by definition, they also require a kind of strategic patience. Is that when you look at the kind of policy that we have now, do you think, A, we have the strategic patience? Because I will say this, Americans are not always known for that. But do you think we have the kind of strategic patience that's required? And do you approach it with an understanding that this is not something that's likely to produce an immediate turnaround in terms of the behaviors that we seek on the part of the Iranian government?
So let me tell you, I live in the world, not just in our Iran program, but in all of our sanctions programs that we are expanding all over the world. I live in the world where I'm not very patient at all, right? I'm not very patient because I don't want to see a single dollar being used to fund terror, period. And so that's why you have seen this massive expansion of our authorities. This is the strongest program that we have ever had against that country, and it's not limited, of course, to just Iran itself. It's all of Iran's proxies. So you see, over the last year, we have had a massive increase in the sanctions against Hezbollah. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, we sanctioned its bank of choice, the Jamal Trust Bank in Lebanon. We've sanctioned members of its parliament. We've had very significant sanctions over the last couple of weeks against Hamas, where we've very specifically there exposed the IRGC Quds Force funding of Hamas. And so for me, on the side of patience, you're not going to see any patience. Every time we find bad actors trying to move money around the world, we're going to go after it. On the diplomatic side, which is the side that you're talking about, I think Secretary Pompeo spoke very well to that. Ultimately, we'd like to get a far better deal than what was negotiated the last time, and President Trump has been open to having those kinds of talks and discussions. But my push, my part of that campaign has zero patience.
Okay, good to know. I want to pick up on what you just said about Hezbollah and Hamas. Hezbollah has a kind of global network. They're in Latin America. There's a connection clearly to drugs, money laundering, and the like. I know that this is something you've paid a lot of attention to. I'm not sure that most people understand just how widespread and complex the network that Hezbollah and indirectly, obviously, the Iranians as well are using. It would be great if you could describe that in a little bit of detail.
So I think what you've seen in our actions all over the world, our actions in the Hezbollah context really have touched all kinds of different parts of the world. Of course, we've taken very significant actions, for example, against financial facilitators who were working in Africa to help Hezbollah get access to the funding that they've needed. We just saw Argentina, Paraguay, in that part of the world declare that Hezbollah is in fact a terrorist organization. And of course, in Argentina, they've suffered terribly at the hands of Hezbollah. And I don't need to talk about their presence in Lebanon, which we all know well. Again, as I look at it, we see them try to ferret money all over the world. And the approach that we've been taking over the last 2 years is to go after the networks that had historically enabled Hezbollah to nefariously get access to that money. And what you see in those networks are individuals who have been involved not just in financing Hezbollah. They've been involved in grave human rights abuses. They've been involved in money laundering and other criminal activity. Look, terrorists are always going to try to find whatever mechanism they can to finance themselves. They're not interested in the rule of law in any way, shape, or form. We are, in my opinion, always going to be better than they are in 5 steps ahead of them in tracking, identifying, and then ultimately disrupting that money. And we are very much intent on working with partners all over the world in doing so. Just last year, for example, the entire GCC joined us in sanctioning Hezbollah's Shura Council and, of course, Hassan Nasrallah himself. And I think you saw the United Kingdom, of course, come out and rightfully recognize that the entire organization is a terrorist group, not just the so-called military wing.
But I was going to ask that because the British have, but in the rest of Europe, we've seen this kind of artificial distinction between the military wing of Hezbollah and what they see as somehow the political wing, as if Nasrallah, and by the way, for anybody who wants to pay attention, he's just given a very long interview, which I invite people to read, which suggests there is no real distinction there. But I'm curious about what you're facing.
Of course there's no distinction. I mean, of course, Nasrallah is saying it himself, there's no distinction. I frankly don't understand why anybody would make a distinction. And the problem when you make a distinction between a so-called military wing and a so-called political wing is that you then give them the opening to use their political wing to fund their military wing. And why would we ever do that? Look, again, bad actors can be sophisticated in how they finance themselves. They're always going to look for front companies, shell companies, false documents to try to move money to themselves. why are we giving them any kind of an opening to do so through a so-called legitimate political wing? For my money, it makes no sense at all.
So when you raise that with counterparts, what is their response to that?
Well, we're pleased that we're having some very positive responses to those arguments. Of course, again, I think the UK took exactly the right position. Argentina is not making that distinction, and we're going to continue to push this message all over the world. And we are, in fact, getting a lot of receptivity to it, and I hope that you'll see other governments come out and do and recognize that there's no distinction. And as Secretary Pompeo has laid out, we have a gloves off policy when it comes to Hezbollah. You know, if you're going to insert yourself into the Lebanese government as a member of Hezbollah, we're going to sanction you. That's what we did just about a month ago, because the distinction, you don't get to live under the cover, as a government actor and trying to shield yourself from our sanctions. That no longer exists.
So let me ask you. It may seem a bit of a theoretical question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The aim of the maximum pressure, and certainly maximum economic pressure, is to put the Iranians in a position, the regime in a position where it will see that the cost of its bad behaviors is too high, and that it needs to come back and not only to negotiate a different deal on their nuclear program, but also that they really have to stop doing what they're doing in the region. Some people might say you could squeeze them to the point where they have nothing to lose, and if they have nothing to lose, their behaviors may become even worse. Can you conceive of a point where we have squeezed the Iranians to the point where they are completely cornered and they have no way out? Is that a concern, or is that not part of the considerations?
So again, I'll just go back to the point that I made before, which is I think you got to squeeze them until they don't have the revenue to engage in the activity that they've been engaging them. That's where the squeeze is, right? Of course, we want to have a deal, and hopefully the maximum pressure campaign will lead us to a far better deal, a deal that includes the WMD, the ballistic missile program, and terror, among other things that Secretary Pompeo laid out in his 12-point plan. But at the end of the day, part of the idea here is to deny them the revenue that they need to engage in these bad acts. And for my money, it's what we do all over the world. Again, with terrorist organizations, we cannot forget this is the largest state sponsor of terror. Every time we squeeze them more, they have less money to finance Hezbollah. They have less money to finance Hamas and other Iranian proxy. And so I fundamentally believe that that's the fundamental precept under which we have to operate.
Is there? I mean, this is also probably a theoretical question. Is it possible for this regime to change its behavior?
Look, I think you've seen historically other regimes change their behavior, and you hope for the people of Iran that'll be the case here.
Are there more things from your
and
standpoint?
For the region, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Are there more things from your standpoint that we can do to reach out to the Iranian public?
I will leave that question to the State Department. But what we do see is, and I see this all over the world, and in my conversations with people who had lived under their reign of terror, we do see a great amount of support in that community for what we're doing, because they lived under it. They understand the deception and the lies, and they also understand that when they were there, their lives weren't prioritized, their families weren't prioritized, they were killed, among other horrific things. So I think, in fact, that you see a lot of support within the country for what we're doing, and And that's really because they're suffering. They're suffering terribly. They've been suffering for a long time, and they want to see an end to it. And they want to see their regime, do what I said from the start, which is start to prioritize food and medicine, and stop prioritizing regional instability.
Okay, I'm looking out and I see that we actually have no more time. I want to thank you. I mean, I think you have explained things very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.